Think back to dawn on September 8th, 1900, Galveston Island, Texas. The beach is empty except for a man walking the shoreline, watching the waves come in wrong. Too high, too fast, not breaking where they should. The water has a strange color, a greenish gray that doesn't match the usual blue-green of the Gulf. The air tastes like salt and something else, something metallic. The man is Isaac Cline, the local Weather Bureau chief. He's 39 years old, confident in his understanding of Gulf Coast weather. He's written papers about how Galveston's geography makes catastrophic storm surge impossible. The shallow bathymetry, the gradual slope of the sea floor, the island's position, all of it protects them. But standing here now, feeling the wind shift, watching the barometer in his office drop faster than he's ever seen, something in his certainty cracks. By this time tomorrow, somewhere between 6,000 and 12,000 people will be dead. The ocean will rise 15 feet and swallow 3/4 of the island. Cline himself will be floating in the wreckage of his own home, his wife drowned, his scientific certainty shattered, along with everything else. This was the deadliest natural disaster in American history. The storm that taught a nation the ocean doesn't negotiate. Galveston in 1900 was the jewel of Texas, the third busiest port in America. Cotton moved through its docks by the millions of bales, headed for mills in England and New England. Fortunes were made in banks and shipping offices. The wealthy built Victorian mansions along Broadway that rivaled anything in the state. Electric streetcars hummed down paved streets. The Grand Opera House hosted European theater companies. This wasn't a backwater. This was power and culture and money, the New York of the Gulf Coast. But all of it sat on a ribbon of sand barely 3 miles wide at its widest point, thrust up between Galveston Bay and the Gulf of Mexico. The highest point on the entire island reached maybe 9 feet above sea level. Beach Avenue, where the finest hotels stood, sat 5 feet above the tide line. The working-class neighborhoods on the Gulf side sat even lower. Nobody worried. Galveston had always been here. That Saturday morning, a man named William was opening his hardware store on Market Street. 34 years old, married, father of 2 daughters. The day felt like late summer clinging on. Humid and overcast, but this was the Gulf Coast in September. Humid was normal. A few customers came in early. One farmer mentioned his barometer at home had dropped lower than he'd ever seen. William nodded, made the sale, thought nothing of it. Weather was always a topic in a coastal town. What William didn't know, what Cline was only beginning to suspect, was what had formed just offshore in the warm Gulf waters. And to understand why nobody saw it coming, you need to understand weather forecasting in 1900. There were no satellites watching from space, no radar, no computer models. The United States Weather Bureau relied on scattered reports from ships and coastal stations, transmitted by telegraph when the lines were working. Forecasters in Washington drew conclusions based on incomplete data and past patterns. Most of the time, it worked well enough. This time, it failed catastrophically. The hurricane had formed in the Atlantic in late August, tracked west across the ocean, passed over Cuba on September 4th with destructive winds, then entered the Gulf of Mexico. The official forecast from Washington predicted it would curve northeast toward Florida. That's what Atlantic hurricanes normally did. Cuban meteorologists disagreed. They had been tracking the system closely. Cuba sat in Hurricane Alley. They had learned to read these storms from brutal necessity. The Cubans sent warnings north. This storm was intensifying. This storm was tracking west toward Texas. Washington dismissed the warnings. Professional rivalry played a role. Political tension from the recent Spanish-American War. Genuine disagreement about forecasting methods. The official prediction held firm. The Cubans were right. Once in the Gulf, the hurricane encountered conditions that meteorologists today would recognize as optimal for explosive intensification. Gulf water temperature in early September hovers around 85 degrees, sometimes warmer. That warm water is hurricane fuel. The storm began feeding, pulling massive amounts of energy from the ocean, its circulation tightening like a wound spring, its central pressure dropping. At the same time, light wind shear meant the storm structure wasn't being torn apart. Upper-level winds allowed it to organize vertically, building a tower of thunderstorms around its eye. and it was moving over the Loop Current, a river of exceptionally warm water that acts like rocket fuel for tropical systems. By the time it approached the Texas coast on September 7th, the hurricane had become a monster. Estimates based on the devastation suggest sustained winds of at least 145 miles per hour, possibly higher. Central pressure was likely around 27.5 inches of mercury or lower, a Category 4 storm at minimum, possibly reaching Category 5 intensity. But the wind, as terrifying as 145-mile-per-hour gusts are, wasn't the real killer. The real killer was what the wind was pushing ahead of it: a dome of water, a storm surge that would rise 15 feet above normal sea level, driven onto the Texas coast by the hurricane's relentless circulation. And Galveston Island, barely existing above the waves on a calm day, sat directly in its path. By Saturday afternoon, Cline had changed his mind about the danger. The barometer was dropping too fast. The tide was rising when it should have been falling. Wind was building from the north, pushing bay water onto the island from behind, while the Gulf surge built offshore. He hitched his buggy and rode along the beach, shouting warnings to people to move inland, to seek higher ground. But where was higher ground on an island that barely rose above the water? William closed his store around 2. The wind was strong enough now to rattle the windows, and customers had stopped coming. He walked home through streets already covered in a film of water. Not rainwater, salt water. The ocean was creeping onto the island, and it wasn't draining away. His wife was packing valuables into a trunk just in case. Their daughters were watching the water lap at the front steps, with the fascination children have for anything unusual. By 3, the situation was critical. Wind screaming at 60 miles per hour and building. Rain coming in horizontal sheets so thick you couldn't see across the street. Water in the roads 2 feet deep and rising fast. This wasn't drainage from the storm. This was the Gulf of Mexico coming onto the island, pushed by the surge, by the screaming wind piling the ocean onto the Texas coast. William made a decision. His house was wood, old, built too close to the Gulf side. They needed brick. He gathered his wife and daughters, and they waded through waist-deep water toward a neighbor's brick home 3 blocks north. The water was warm, body temperature, almost pleasant except for the terror. Other families had the same idea. 40 people crowded into the second floor of the brick house. Through the windows, they watched the water climb the outside walls. First floor gone, still rising. The storm surge peaked around 7 in the evening, 15 feet above normal sea level. In some locations, pushed higher by local bathymetry and wave action, perhaps 20 feet. 3/4 of Galveston Island was underwater. The sound was what survivors would remember for the rest of their lives. Not just wind, though it was howling at over 100 miles per hour, gusts far higher, but the crack and splinter of buildings collapsing, the shriek of nails pulling from wood, glass shattering, the roar of water moving through streets that had become rivers, carrying entire houses, wagons, fences, trees, everything not bolted to bedrock, and underneath it all, a deeper rumble, the bass note of the ocean itself asserting its power. In the darkness, in the screaming wind, William's brick shelter held, barely. Water reached the second-floor windows, lapping at the sills. They could hear houses outside exploding into wreckage, the debris becoming battering rams against everything still standing. A woman near the window started praying. Others joined, their voices rising and falling with the wind. William held his younger daughter, feeling her heartbeat against his chest, faster than seemed possible. Around midnight, something changed. A tremendous crash from outside, then screaming. Part of the neighboring house had collapsed onto their roof, punching through the ceiling. Water began pouring in. William handed his daughter to his wife and moved toward the breach. Another man was already there, an elderly neighbor named Mr. Chen, who ran the laundry on Tremont Street. Together they pulled debris, stuffed it into the hole, used their own bodies to block the water. They stood there for 2 hours, backs pressed against splintered wood and surging water, holding the breach closed while the storm raged. William's arms went numb. His back screamed. He didn't move. When the wind finally began to ease, when the water started receding around 2 in the morning, William and Mr. Chen were still there, still holding. The older man looked at him in the darkness and said something in Cantonese that William didn't understand. But he understood the nod. They'd held. 3 miles from downtown, at St. Mary's Orphanage, the Sisters of Charity had tied 93 children to themselves with clothesline, creating human chains so they wouldn't be separated when the building collapsed. When the surge hit, the structure disintegrated. The ropes meant to save them became anchors pulling them down. Only 3 boys survived, found the next morning, clinging to a tree, the clothesline still wrapped around one child's waist. Isaac Cline had brought his family to his own house, believing his understanding of storm mechanics would protect them. His pregnant wife, 3 young daughters, his brother Joseph, and about 50 neighbors who trusted his expertise. By 6:30, the water was at the 2nd floor and still rising. Cline checked his barometer one last time. 28.48 inches of mercury, lower than he'd ever seen. Then the house exploded. Not collapsed, exploded. The surge hit it like artillery and blew it apart. Cline was knocked unconscious, pinned underwater beneath wreckage. When he fought to the surface, gasping, he found his 6-year-old daughter Allie Rose clinging to debris nearby. He grabbed her, pulled her onto a piece of his roof that was floating in the maelstrom. Through the darkness they drifted, and by pure chance he found his other 2 daughters. His wife was gone. He called her name for hours into the screaming wind. She never answered. Of the 50 people who'd sheltered in his house, fewer than half survived the night. By dawn on Sunday, the wind had stopped. The water had drained back into the Gulf, leaving behind a world that no longer made sense. Entire neighborhoods had vanished. Where streets had been, there were now fields of wreckage stretching to the horizon. Splintered lumber, twisted iron, shattered furniture, torn clothing, all of it mixed into a grotesque mass, 10, 15, 20 feet high in places. And everywhere, tangled in the debris like driftwood, were bodies, thousands of them. William and his family survived. Mr. Chen survived. When they emerged into the morning light and made their way back to where William's house had stood, there was nothing. Just the foundation stones and a few scattered possessions they couldn't identify, but they were alive. The death toll would never be known precisely. The city had no complete census. Entire families were wiped out with no one left to report them missing. Bodies were so numerous, so decomposed in the September heat, that individual identification became impossible. The official count settled around 6,000. Some historians believe the true number reached 8,000, possibly 10,000, perhaps even 12,000. It remains the deadliest natural disaster in American history. Galveston had no infrastructure to handle mass burials. The saturated ground couldn't hold graves. Bodies placed in the earth washed out with the tides. Officials loaded the dead onto barges for burial at sea. The Gulf rejected them. Bodies washed back to shore. Finally, in desperation, they began burning them. Funeral pyres burned for weeks. The smell of burning flesh and wood mixing with salt air and decay. Survivors would say decades later they could never forget that smell. Among the dead, searchers found a woman still clutching a photograph of her children, the image protected in a leather case pressed against her chest. They found a man who died with a death grip on a door frame, his fingers locked so tight they had to break them to move the body. They found a little girl's shoe, still carefully tied, the foot still inside it, separated from everything else. But Galveston chose to rebuild. Not just rebuild, but transform itself in a way that would protect against another storm. The solution was audacious. They would raise the entire city. Starting in 1902, engineers pumped sand dredged from the ship channel underneath the city. Block by block, building by building, they jacked structures up on stilts and filled the space beneath. Some buildings rose over 15 feet. Houses sat elevated on timber supports for months, floating in midair while crews worked underneath. The project took 7 years and moved more than 16 million cubic yards of sand. When finished, the grade at the island center stood 8 to 10 feet higher than before. At the same time, they built the seawall, 17 feet high, 16 feet wide at the base, engineered to absorb storm surge and deflect waves back into the Gulf. It curved along 3 miles of beachfront initially, later extended to 10 miles. The wall stands today. The engineering worked. When Hurricane Ike struck in 2008 with surge nearly as high as 1900, the seawall held. The city flooded, yes, but it didn't vanish. The dead numbered in dozens, not thousands. But Galveston never recovered what it lost that September night. Before 1900, it was destined to become the greatest port on the Gulf Coast. After, investors looked inland. Houston, protected by 50 miles of coastal plain, became the destination. The ship channel was dredged there, port facilities were built there, oil discoveries accelerated the shift. Galveston became what it is today, a beach town that remembers what it used to be. The disaster changed how America understood hurricanes. The Weather Bureau reorganized its warning system completely, better communication with Caribbean forecasters, more respect for Cuban and Mexican expertise, investment in coastal observation stations, the recognition that these storms deserved humility, not confidence. It also drove technological change, the push for better forecasting, for ways to see storms before they arrived, for communication systems that could warn coastal communities. All of it intensified. Within decades, weather reconnaissance flights began. Within a century, satellites watched from space. Every improvement in hurricane forecasting traces some lineage back to September 1900. Stand on the Galveston seawall today and look out at the Gulf. The water spreads to the horizon, calm most days. Tourists walk beaches where thousands died. The wall itself doesn't look like a monument, just concrete doing its job, but it is one, to the dead, to the survivors, to the recognition that this island exists on the ocean's terms. Somewhere beneath the raised streets lie the foundations of the city that drowned. Above them, survivors built something new, not the same, but still here, still standing. The sea remembers September 8th, 1900. So does Galveston.